I'm Dr. Celestine Ravenwood, and I spent 14 years as a forensic pathologist at Blackthorne Medical Institute in Salem, Oregon, or at least I did, until I submitted my resignation 4 months ago. You can call me Dr. Ravenwood if you want, though most people in the pathology department just called me the Bone Whisperer during my time there. I've performed over 4,200 autopsies in my career: homicides, overdoses, accidents, mysterious deaths, and every conceivable way the human body can cease to function. But what I'm about to tell you about happened during my very first autopsy as a fourth-year medical student, and it's the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about death, consciousness, and the absolute finality of human existence. This case ultimately led me to abandon forensic pathology entirely and left me with questions that still haunt me 15 years later. Blackthorne Medical Institute is one of the most respected forensic pathology training centers on the West Coast, renowned for its cutting-edge research into post-mortem examination techniques and death investigation protocols. The institute handles over 2,000 cases annually, from routine natural deaths to the most complex criminal investigations. During my 4 years of medical school there, I was completely captivated by the precision and scientific certainty that forensic pathology seemed to offer. Unlike clinical medicine, where patients could recover unexpectedly, where symptoms could mislead, and where diagnoses might prove incorrect, death investigation appeared to provide absolute answers. The deceased couldn't lie about their symptoms, couldn't hide their medical history through embarrassment or fear, and couldn't recover to contradict your findings. Death, my professors repeatedly emphasized, was the most definitive diagnosis in all of medicine. Dr. Morgana Blackwood, our department head, used to tell us that forensic pathologists were the ultimate medical detectives. The living can deceive us, she would say during our morning conferences, but the dead are compelled to tell the truth. Every injury, every disease process, every cause of death leaves an indelible mark that we can read like a book. Our job is simply to interpret the evidence that death itself has preserved for us. I had always been drawn to this certainty, this sense that in a world full of ambiguity and uncertainty, forensic pathology offered clear, irrefutable answers. By my senior year, I had already been accepted into the Institute's prestigious forensic pathology residency program. I was planning to dedicate my career to speaking for the dead, to uncovering truths that only a thorough post-mortem examination could reveal. It was November 3rd, 1999, a gray, drizzling Thursday morning typical of Oregon's autumn weather. I arrived at the Institute at 6:30 a.m., 30 minutes early, because I was nervous and excited about my first official autopsy as a senior medical student. Dr. Lysander Grimshaw, the chief medical examiner, had personally selected what he described as an ideal introductory case for my initial hands-on experience with post-mortem examination procedures. The case involved Isabella Cordelia Ashworth, a 38-year-old freelance graphic designer who had been discovered deceased in her downtown Salem apartment by her sister Ophelia after Isabella had missed 3 consecutive client meetings without explanation. Ophelia had used her spare key to check on Isabella and found her lying peacefully on her living room couch, apparently having died while reading a novel that was still open on her chest. The initial police investigation had revealed no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle or foul play, and no obvious indicators of suicide. Isabella's apartment was neat and organized, her medications were accounted for, and there were no suicide notes or messages suggesting self-harm. The preliminary assessment suggested what Dr. Grimshaw called a classic sudden natural death. exactly the type of case he felt would provide excellent educational value without the emotional complexity of trauma or the legal complications of suspicious circumstances. During the case briefing that morning, Dr. Grimshaw shared Isabella's background with me in detail. She had been a talented and successful graphic designer, specializing in book cover designs for independent publishers. Her work was well regarded in her field, and she had built a stable client base that provided her with a comfortable income and creative fulfillment. Isabella had never married but maintained close relationships with her family, particularly her sister Ophelia and her elderly parents who lived in nearby Portland. She was described by everyone who knew her as gentle, artistic, and deeply spiritual. Isabella practiced meditation regularly, was a vegetarian, and spent her free time painting watercolor landscapes and volunteering at the local animal shelter. Most importantly, from a medical perspective, Isabella had no known serious health conditions. Her last physical examination, 6 months earlier, had been completely normal. She didn't smoke, rarely drank alcohol, exercised regularly through yoga and hiking, and had no family history of sudden cardiac death or other conditions that might explain an unexpected death at such a young age. This is exactly the kind of case where forensic pathology earns its keep, Dr. Grimshaw explained as we reviewed her file. When someone young and apparently healthy dies suddenly with no obvious cause, it's our responsibility to find the answer. Isabella's family deserves to know what happened, and the medical community needs to understand whether this represents an undiagnosed condition that might affect other people. When I first saw Isabella Ashworth's body in the examination room, I was immediately struck by how extraordinarily peaceful she appeared. Even after being deceased for an estimated 4 days, she looked as though she had simply fallen into the deepest, most restful sleep imaginable. Her long auburn hair was spread naturally across the examination table. Her face was completely relaxed and serene, and her hands were positioned comfortably at her sides. There was something almost ethereal about her appearance that went beyond the typical peaceful look of some deceased individuals. Isabella's skin had a faint, almost luminous quality that seemed unusual for someone who had been dead for several days. Her lips retained a subtle pink coloration that looked more like health than the typical pallor of death. Dr. Grimshaw noted my observation and explained that environmental factors in Isabella's apartment, cool temperatures, low humidity, and minimal air circulation, had helped preserve her body in excellent condition. Some individuals also seem to maintain their appearance better in death, he added. It's not uncommon, and it often provides comfort to families to see their loved one looking peaceful and undisturbed. The external examination revealed absolutely nothing suspicious or unusual. Isabella was a well-nourished woman of normal build, showing minimal signs of decomposition despite having been deceased for an estimated 96 hours. Her fingernails were clean and undamaged. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of injection sites, no evidence of physical trauma, and no external indicators that might suggest a cause of death. Before beginning the internal examination, Dr. Grimshaw used Isabella's case to teach me the fundamental biological and medical principles of death determination. Death, he explained with scientific precision, occurs when the 3 critical life systems, cardiovascular, respiratory, and neurological, cease to function in an integrated manner. Death is not a single moment, he told me as we prepared our instruments, but rather a process that begins when the heart stops pumping oxygenated blood to the brain. Once brain cells are deprived of oxygen for more than 4 to 6 minutes, irreversible damage occurs. The electrical activity that constitutes consciousness ceases permanently, and the complex biochemical processes that maintain life shut down in a cascade that cannot be reversed. He explained that once this process begins, the human body becomes subject to the laws of physics and chemistry rather than biology. Decomposition, rigor mortis, and livor mortis are simply the predictable results of biochemical breakdown in the absence of the regulatory mechanisms that maintain life. The most important thing you must understand, Celestine, Dr. Grimshaw emphasized, is that death is absolutely final. Unlike every other medical condition, there is no recovery, no remission, no unexpected improvement. Once the brain dies, consciousness is extinguished forever. The dead do not dream, do not think, do not feel, and most certainly do not wake up. This is the one absolute certainty in all of medicine. He went on to explain that while popular culture often portrayed death as mysterious or ambiguous, medical science had thoroughly documented and understood the physiological processes involved. Modern equipment could detect the faintest electrical activity in the brain, the slightest circulation in the cardiovascular system, and the most minimal respiratory function. When all of these indicators confirmed death, there was no possibility of error or reversal. At 9:45 a.m., Dr. Grimshaw began the standard autopsy procedure with the classic Y incision. He started at each shoulder, brought the cuts together at the sternum, and then continued with a single incision down to the pubic bone. I assisted by maintaining the surgical field, handling instruments, and taking detailed notes as he methodically examined each organ system. The autopsy proceeded exactly as described in our textbooks. Isabella's heart showed no evidence of coronary artery disease, congenital abnormalities, or acute cardiac events. Her coronary arteries were clear, her heart muscle appeared healthy and normal, and there were no signs of the kind of sudden cardiac death that might explain her unexpected demise. Her lungs were completely clear, with no evidence of pneumonia, embolism, or other respiratory conditions. The lung tissue was pink and healthy looking, showing none of the congestion or pathology that might indicate breathing difficulties or oxygen deprivation as a cause of death. As we continued through the examination, Dr. Grimshaw maintained a running commentary about proper procedures, the importance of systematic documentation, and the legal requirements for forensic autopsies. The atmosphere was professional, educational, and routine. This was exactly the kind of learning experience I had anticipated: methodical, scientific, and instructive. About 2 hours into the procedure, as Dr. Grimshaw was examining Isabella's liver and digestive system, I began noticing small details that seemed inconsistent with what I had been taught about post-mortem changes. Isabella's body temperature seemed warmer than I expected for someone who had been deceased for 4 days. When Dr. Grimshaw repositioned her arm to better access the abdominal cavity, the limb moved with surprising flexibility, rather than the stiffness I associated with rigor mortis. Most unusual was the coloration of Isabella's skin and fingernails. Instead of the pallor and blue-gray tinting typical of deceased individuals, she maintained a faint pink flush that looked almost like subtle circulation. Her fingernails, in particular, had a healthy pink coloration that seemed inconsistent with complete circulatory failure. When I mentioned these observations to Dr. Grimshaw, he provided rational explanations for each concern. The morgue's temperature control system could affect body temperature readings. Rigor mortis was not permanent and would naturally dissipate after 24-48 hours. The coloration changes I was noticing could be explained by the specific environmental conditions in Isabella's apartment and the particular timeline of her death.
"You're being very observant, Celestine," he told me approvingly, "but you're also overthinking normal post-mortem variations. Every body is different, and decomposition doesn't follow exactly the same pattern in every case. What you're seeing falls well within the range of normal post-mortem changes." Despite Dr. Grimshaw's reassurances, my sense of unease continued to grow as the autopsy progressed. There were subtle details about Isabella's condition that seemed to contradict everything I had learned about death and decomposition. Her hair, for instance, seemed to have more natural shine and flexibility than I expected from someone deceased for several days. When Dr. Grimshaw moved her head to examine the neck area, her hair fell naturally, rather than with the brittle stiffness typical of deceased individuals. More disturbing was what appeared to be extremely minimal but detectable moisture in Isabella's mouth and eyes. According to our textbooks, dehydration was one of the most immediate and obvious signs of death, yet Isabella seemed to retain some level of natural moisture in her mucous membranes. I also noticed that Isabella's body showed none of the typical settling patterns of blood and bodily fluids that should have been evident after 4 days. Livor mortis, the pooling of blood in the lower portions of the body due to gravity, was barely detectable, and what little was present seemed inconsistent with someone who had been lying on a couch for the estimated time period. Each time I raised these concerns, Dr. Grimshaw provided scientifically sound explanations. Environmental factors could account for preservation variations. Individual body chemistry affected decomposition rates. The position and circumstances of death could influence the typical patterns we expected to see. But privately, I was becoming increasingly convinced that something was fundamentally wrong with this case, though I couldn't articulate exactly what it was or why it bothered me so deeply. By 1:30 p.m., we had completed the examination of all major organ systems and had found no obvious cause of death. Isabella's heart, lungs, liver, kidneys and digestive system all appeared healthy and normal for a 38-year-old woman. There were no signs of poisoning, no evidence of drug overdose, no indicators of infection or disease that might explain her sudden death. Dr. Grimshaw decided that our final step would be a thorough examination of Isabella's brain tissue. Sometimes, he explained, the cause of sudden death in young, healthy individuals could be found in neurological conditions that weren't immediately apparent: undetected aneurysms, small strokes, or rare brain abnormalities that could cause instant death without external symptoms. The brain examination is often where we find our answers in cases like this, he told me as he prepared the instruments necessary for opening the skull. Isabella's going to tell us her story, but she saved the most important chapter for last. As he positioned his scalpel to begin the incisions necessary to remove the skull cap and access the brain tissue, Dr. Grimshaw remarked that this had been an excellent learning case despite the lack of an obvious cause of death. Sometimes, he said, the most educational cases were the ones that required the most thorough investigation. Death investigation isn't always straightforward, he explained, but every body tells a story if you know how to read the evidence. Isabella here has been very patient with us, and now she's going to reveal the final piece of the puzzle. It was at that exact moment, as Dr. Grimshaw raised his scalpel to begin the skull incisions, that Isabella Cordelia Ashworth opened both of her eyes, looked directly at me with the clearest, most intelligent gaze I had ever seen, and spoke in a voice as clear and gentle as a morning prayer. "Please, Dr. Ravenwood, I'm not ready to leave yet. There's something I need to tell you about what death really is." What happened next would shatter every certainty I had about death, consciousness, and the absolute finality of human existence. It would force me to confront the possibility that everything medical science believes about death might be fundamentally incomplete, and it would ultimately drive me from the profession I had planned to dedicate my life to. The scalpel fell from Dr. Grimshaw's hand and clattered against the examination table with a metallic ring that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent morgue. For several seconds, neither of us could move, speak, or even breathe. Isabella Ashworth was looking directly at me with eyes that were not only alive but radiating an intelligence and awareness that seemed almost otherworldly. "This is medically impossible," Dr. Grimshaw whispered, his voice barely audible. His face had gone completely pale, and I could see his hands trembling as he stared at Isabella. "She's been dead for 4 days. We've documented complete absence of vital signs. We've performed an extensive internal examination. This cannot be happening." Isabella turned her gaze to Dr. Grimshaw with what appeared to be gentle compassion. "Dr. Grimshaw," she said softly, "I know this is frightening for both of you, but I need you to listen carefully because I don't have much time, and what I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about death and consciousness." Her voice was clear, warm, and completely coherent. This wasn't the confused rambling of someone emerging from a coma, or the disoriented speech of someone experiencing a medical emergency. Isabella was speaking with perfect clarity and obvious purpose, as if she had been conscious and aware throughout the entire autopsy procedure. Dr. Grimshaw immediately rushed to check Isabella's vital signs with every instrument available in the morgue. The cardiac monitor showed a steady normal heart rhythm. Her blood pressure was 110/70ths, completely normal for a healthy adult. Her respiratory rate was even and unlabored. Her pupils responded appropriately to light, and her reflexes were not only present but completely normal. "This is impossible," he kept repeating as he ran test after test. Her body temperature was 68 degrees an hour ago. She showed complete rigor mortis yesterday. She's been dead for 4 days. We have documentation, photographs, witness statements. Meanwhile, Isabella remained calm and patient, watching our frantic medical assessments with what seemed like gentle amusement. When Dr. Grimshaw attempted to call for emergency medical assistance, Isabella spoke again. "Dr. Grimshaw, please don't call anyone yet," she said. "What's happening to me isn't a medical emergency that can be treated in a hospital. This is something entirely different, and if you bring other people here before I can explain, you'll lose the opportunity to understand what death really is." I found myself staring at Isabella's chest, watching it rise and fall with normal breathing patterns. More impossibly, I could see what appeared to be normal circulation in her skin. The Y incision that Dr. Grimshaw had made was still visible, but it wasn't bleeding, and her organs, which had been exposed during the examination, seemed to be functioning normally, despite the massive surgical disruption. "Dr. Ravenwood," Isabella said, focusing her attention on me, "I chose to speak to you specifically because you're just beginning your career, and your mind is still open to possibilities that established physicians have learned to dismiss. What I'm about to tell you challenges everything medical science believes about consciousness and death." She paused, taking a deep breath that should have been impossible for someone whose chest cavity had been opened hours earlier. "Death, as you understand it, is not the end of consciousness," Isabella continued. "It's a transition to a different state of awareness. For the past 4 days, I have been conscious and aware, but existing in a realm that medicine cannot detect or measure. I heard every word of your examination. I felt every procedure you performed. I was present, just not in the way your instruments can measure." Dr. Grimshaw was frantically taking notes while simultaneously monitoring Isabella's vital signs, which continued to show completely normal life functions. "This defies every law of biology and physics," he muttered. "Cellular death is irreversible. Brain death is permanent. What you're describing is scientifically impossible." Isabella smiled with infinite patience. "Dr. Grimshaw, your science is based on the assumption that consciousness is produced by the brain. But what if consciousness uses the brain the way a radio uses an antenna? When the antenna is damaged or destroyed, the radio goes silent, but the signal continues to exist. Death doesn't destroy consciousness. It simply changes the frequency on which consciousness operates." To prove her awareness during the period when she was medically dead, Isabella began recounting specific details from the past 4 days that she could not possibly have known if she had been unconscious. She described conversations that Dr. Grimshaw and I had about the case while standing over her body. She repeated word-for-word discussions that had taken place in the hallway outside the morgue. She accurately described the contents of files that had been reviewed in offices 2 floors away from where her body was being stored. Most incredibly, Isabella described events that had occurred in her apartment after her body was discovered, including specific conversations between police investigators and details about the evidence collection process that she could not have witnessed with her physical senses. "On Monday morning," she said, "Detective Morrison found my journal in the bedroom and read the entry where I wrote about having strange dreams about crossing over to a different realm of existence. He commented to his partner that I seemed to have had premonitions about my own death. You can verify this information." Dr. Grimshaw immediately called Detective Morrison, who confirmed every detail Isabella had provided about the investigation, including the private comment about the journal entry that had not been included in any official reports. How is this possible? I asked Isabella directly. How can you know things that happened when your body was here in the morgue? Because consciousness isn't confined to the physical body, Isabella replied. During what you call death, awareness expands rather than contracts. I could perceive events throughout this building, throughout the city, anywhere my attention was drawn. Death opened doorways of perception that the living brain cannot access. As we spoke with Isabella, I began to notice subtle changes in her condition. While her vital signs remained stable and her speech stayed clear, there was a gradually increasing translucent quality to her appearance. It was as if she was slowly becoming less solid, less anchored to physical reality. I can feel myself being drawn back, Isabella said, her voice taking on a distant quality. The connection to my physical body is temporary. I was allowed to return briefly to deliver this message, but I cannot remain here indefinitely. Dr. Grimshaw, who had been documenting everything with cameras and recording equipment, asked urgently, "What message? What are you trying to tell us?" Isabella's expression became serious and intent. The message is that consciousness survives death, and that the medical profession's understanding of death is incomplete. There are millions of people in comas, vegetative states, and near-death situations who are far more aware than your instruments can detect. Death is not the end, it's a graduation to a different level of existence. Her voice was becoming fainter, though her lips continued to move normally. Dr. Ravenwood, you have a choice to make. You can dismiss this experience as impossible and continue practicing medicine based on incomplete understanding, or you can dedicate your career to exploring the mysteries of consciousness and death. As Isabella continued to speak, her physical form became increasingly ethereal. Her vital signs, which had been completely normal, began to fluctuate wildly before gradually returning to the absence of any detectable life functions. Her heart rate slowed and stopped. Her breathing became shallow and then ceased entirely. Her body temperature began dropping rapidly. But throughout this process, Isabella remained conscious and communicative, even as her physical body was clearly dying once again. "Don't be afraid," she whispered, as her form became barely visible. "Death is not an ending, it's a doorway. The dead are not gone, they've simply moved to a frequency that the living cannot usually perceive." Her final words were spoken in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Remember that consciousness is the one thing that cannot be destroyed. Everything else is temporary, but awareness itself is eternal." At 3:17 p.m., Isabella Ashworth was once again medically dead, showing no detectable vital signs, no brain activity, and no signs of life, according to every instrument available to medical science. But this time, her death felt different, not like an ending, but like a completion. Within hours of Isabella's impossible resurrection and second death, Blackthorne Medical Institute was in complete chaos. Dr. Grimshaw's recordings and photographs documented every moment of the impossible event, but the medical establishment's response was swift and decisive. The case was classified as a mass hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. The official report stated that both Dr. Grimshaw and I had experienced a shared psychotic episode, possibly triggered by fatigue and the emotional pressure of my first autopsy. Isabella's cause of death was listed as sudden cardiac arrhythmia, and all evidence of her temporary resurrection was sealed in confidential files. Dr. Grimshaw was placed on administrative leave and underwent mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Within 6 months, he resigned from Blackthorne and moved to a small town where he opened a general practice, never again working in forensic pathology. I was required to undergo psychological counseling and was strongly advised to consider a different medical specialty. The message was clear. If I wanted to continue in medicine, I needed to forget what had happened and never speak of it again. Isabella's resurrection and her message about consciousness surviving death created a crisis of faith that I could not resolve within the confines of traditional medicine. How could I continue practicing forensic pathology when I had witnessed definitive proof that death was not what medical science believed it to be? For months after the incident,
I found myself questioning every autopsy, every death certificate, every declaration of death I witnessed. But when families asked me about their loved ones' final moments, I wondered, were they really gone? Or were they existing in a state of awareness that our instruments couldn't detect? The weight of these questions made it impossible for me to function as a forensic pathologist. I began seeing death not as a medical event to be investigated, but as a mysterious transition that medical science was completely unequipped to understand. 18 months after Isabella's case, I made the decision to leave forensic pathology entirely. I could not continue in a profession that I now knew was based on fundamentally incomplete understanding of consciousness and death. I moved to a small coastal town in Northern California and opened a grief counseling practice, specializing in helping families who had lost loved ones suddenly or under mysterious circumstances. I never revealed the details of Isabella's case to my clients, but her message about consciousness surviving death informed every conversation I had with grieving families. In my counseling work, I began to notice patterns that supported Isabella's revelations. Family members often reported feeling the presence of deceased loved ones, receiving communications through dreams, or experiencing signs that suggested ongoing consciousness after death. Rather than dismissing these experiences as grief-induced hallucinations, I learned to listen and validate the possibility that consciousness might indeed survive physical death. 15 years have passed since Isabella Ashworth opened her eyes on that autopsy table and changed my understanding of life, death, and consciousness forever. I have never spoken publicly about what happened that day, but Isabella's message has guided every aspect of my life and work since then. In my grief counseling practice, I have worked with thousands of families who have lost loved ones, and I have seen countless examples of experiences that suggest consciousness continues after physical death. While I cannot prove scientifically what Isabella showed me, I have learned to approach death as a mystery rather than a medical certainty. The case of Isabella Ashworth remains the most profound and transformative experience of my life. It taught me that the boundaries between life and death, between consciousness and unconsciousness, between the possible and the impossible, are far more fluid than medical science acknowledges. Isabella was right about one thing: I did have a choice to make. I could have dismissed her resurrection as impossible and continued practicing medicine based on incomplete understanding, or I could dedicate my career to exploring the mysteries of consciousness and death. I chose the latter, and it has made all the difference. Today, when I work with families who are facing the death of a loved one, I remember Isabella's words: death is not an ending, it's a doorway. While I cannot offer scientific proof of consciousness surviving death, I can offer the comfort that comes from knowing that our understanding of death is incomplete, and that the possibility of continued awareness should not be dismissed simply because it challenges current medical knowledge. The case of Isabella Ashworth will always remain the most unexplained and humbling experience of my career. It reminded me that medicine, for all its advances and sophistication, still contains profound mysteries that challenge our most basic assumptions about consciousness, death, and what it means to be truly alive. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones that cannot be measured, documented, or proven, but must simply be experienced and remembered.